The city streets buzzed with the usual hum of life, but for Ayanna Williams the world felt different today. Heavier, more dangerous. The sun dipped low behind the towering buildings, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch farther than normal, wrapping around the alleys and corners in an almost ominous embrace. The air, thick with the aroma of hot asphalt and food vendors, felt suffocating. Ayanna wheeled herself down the sidewalk, the rhythmic hum of her wheelchair the only sound that filled her ears. It was a familiar walk, a journey she had taken countless times before. But today, something felt off. The streets she knew so well were suddenly foreign, hostile. Her brown eyes darted from one corner of the street to another, catching brief glimpses of people watching her. It wasn't the usual glances that came from curious strangers. No, these were different, harder, more calculating. Some stared with judgment, others with disdain. The whispers she had grown accustomed to now felt louder, more pointed, as if she were the target of some invisible force, the air thick with the weight of unspoken words. There was something about her, something that didn't fit their image of who belonged in this neighborhood, and it unsettled her. Ayanna pushed her wheelchair harder, trying to ignore the feeling creeping up her spine, but the intensity of the stares only grew. She passed a group of men standing outside a rundown building, their laughter suddenly cutting through the noise of the street. They didn't stop laughing when they saw her, but their eyes tracked her every movement, their sneers never leaving their faces. She tried to ignore them, focusing on the path ahead, but their presence was suffocating. The tension in the air was almost tangible, and the constant hum of her chair, which had once been a comfort, now felt like a harsh reminder of her vulnerability. Despite her physical challenges, her wheelchair, the pain that never fully left her legs, the exhaustion she carried in her bones, Ayanna had always walked with purpose. She had fought hard to get to where she was, a respected investigator, an unwavering force in a world that often underestimated her. But today, as the city felt like it was closing in on her, that sense of purpose wavered. She had been trained to be strong, to stand her ground, to never show weakness. Yet here, in the face of these unknown men, she felt small, alone. She tried to push the thought away, focusing instead on the mission at hand. The message had been clear. The FBI had intel on something big, and she was the one to follow up. Yet even as the mission kept her mind occupied, her instincts screamed that something wasn't right. Something was off about this encounter. Ayanna could sense it, the unmistakable weight of danger hovering in the air like a storm waiting to break. As she approached the corner of the street, the distant sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, more deliberate. A glance over her shoulder confirmed her suspicion. 3 men were walking towards her, their posture aggressive, their gait purposeful. She had seen them before, on the fringes of a criminal organization she had been investigating for months, but never this close, never this bold. Her heart skipped a beat. They were getting closer, and she couldn't afford to make a scene. Not here. Not now. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She could feel the weight of their eyes on her, the sense of powerlessness gnawing at her. But Ayanna Williams wasn't one to back down, not even when the odds were stacked against her. She steeled herself for what was to come, drawing strength from her own resilience. She had survived worse than this. She had been underestimated for most of her life. Her disability, her race, and her gender had all been used against her in ways she had learned to navigate. But she was stronger than they knew. As the men got closer, one of them, a tall figure, with a menacing glare, stepped in front of her. He was blocking her path, and his eyes were cold, devoid of any hint of humanity. "You don't belong here, do you?" His voice was low, threatening, his words dripping with contempt. Ayanna's grip on the wheels tightened. She met his gaze, her heart pounding in her chest, but she didn't let her fear show. "I don't need to explain myself to you," she said, her voice steady, though the words felt like a challenge. The man's lips curled into a sneer, and for a moment Ayanna thought she might be in real trouble. But then something strange happened. His expression shifted, his eyes narrowing as if he had recognized something in her. A flicker of hesitation crossed his face, though it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. He looked over his shoulder to the other men, a silent exchange taking place between them. Ayanna felt a pang of unease, something shifting in the air around them. It wasn't just the tension of the moment. It was something deeper, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. "Leave her alone," another voice interrupted, this one from the shadows. A man's figure emerged from the alleyway beside her. His stance was familiar, confident, and as he stepped closer, Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. This was not just any man. This was someone she had seen only in pictures, someone who shouldn't have been in this part of town. The same man who had been leading a string of high-profile investigations within the FBI. Her instincts flared. Something about this wasn't adding up. "FBI agent," the newcomer stated, his gaze sharp. He was looking directly at Ayanna, though the others hadn't caught on. The tension in the group of men suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. Ayanna's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. She was used to being in control, used to calling the shots. But now her position had shifted, and she didn't know who to trust. The world around her seemed to close in. The shadows grew longer, the sounds of the street dimming as the unknown. Men watched her every move. The weight of their stare pressed against her chest. What was happening? Why were they following her? And what did they know about her that she didn't? Before she could react, the man stepped closer, his expression unreadable. "You really don't know, do you?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Ayanna's heart skipped a beat. What was going on? And in that moment, everything she knew, everything she had worked for, felt like it was about to come crashing down. Ayanna took a deep breath, steadying herself as the man's piercing gaze locked onto hers. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but her mind raced with the rush of memories and doubts she had learned to keep buried deep inside. She could feel the weight of the city pressing down on her shoulders, each step of her wheelchair, an echo of every hurdle she had overcome. She had fought so hard to get here, to earn her place in a world that rarely made space for someone like her, black, disabled, and a woman in a field dominated by men. She had fought against the odds, but those same odds had a way of following her, creeping up on her when she least expected it. Her mind drifted back to the words of her late mother, a woman who had been her anchor in the storm of life. "You have to stand tall, Ayanna. Never let them see you falter. The world will try to break you, but only you can decide if it succeeds." She could almost hear her mother's voice, soft yet firm, the same voice that had encouraged her to push past the whispers and the stares. It was advice Ayanna had held on to for as long as she could remember, and yet, in moments like this, it felt harder to believe. The man standing in front of her, his eyes burning with an unspoken challenge, made her question everything she thought she knew about her own strength. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice unwavering but with a hint of suspicion. She had learned, over the years, that asking questions was both a weapon and a shield, especially when she wasn't sure who could be trusted. The man remained silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. There was something about him, something familiar that Ayanna couldn't place. It wasn't just the uniform he wore or the air of authority that clung to him. No, it was something more personal, something that made her feel like she had seen him before, somewhere, at some point. Her heart skipped a beat as a flash of memory came rushing to the surface. A briefing room, a dossier in her hands, the face of a man who had been assigned to work with her on a mission not long ago. But that couldn't be him. He was supposed to be in a different city, a different case. "I asked you a question," she pressed, her tone sharp. The wheelchair's wheels creaked under her weight, and for a moment the man glanced at it, almost as though he were acknowledging her disability in a way that felt too calculated. A small flicker of recognition crossed his face, but it was quickly masked by a cold professionalism. "I'm here to help you, Williams," he finally said, his voice low. "But right now, we need to get you somewhere safe." Ayanna's brow furrowed. Safe? Her thoughts were scattered, a whirlwind of confusion and suspicion. From what? And why are you following me? I'm not following you. I'm making sure you don't get hurt, he replied, his eyes darting briefly to the men who had been lingering near her. The tension between them was palpable, like the calm before a storm. But what was happening now felt more like the quiet moments of a battle yet to be fought. She could feel her pulse quicken, but she refused to let fear take control. Fear was something she had learned to outgrow in the years of navigating life in a body that was not always cooperative. The pain, the limitations, those were things she faced every single day. But what she couldn't face was the feeling of being pushed into a corner. It had happened before. It had happened too many times. People underestimated her because of her disability, because of her appearance, because of everything they thought they knew about her. She wasn't going to let it happen again. So what is it? What's really going on here? Ayana asked again, her voice firmer now. The man's silence was more unnerving than his words, but before he could respond, the men from earlier started moving closer. The leader, the tall figure with the sneer, cracked his knuckles with a deliberate, menacing sound. The quiet moments between them were suddenly filled with the threat of violence. Ayana glanced at the newcomer once more. "What's your game?" she demanded, her mind racing. He was here for a reason, of that much she was sure. But the question was why? Was he trying to warn her, or was he part of something darker? The man gave a subtle nod to the men, and they hesitated, sensing something had shifted in the atmosphere. Ayana felt a strange chill crawl up her spine. The balance had tipped. No longer was she the one being intimidated. No longer was she the target. She had become the center of something much larger, something that was slowly revealing itself piece by piece. In the midst of this tension, a familiar figure emerged from the crowd. Marcus, her former partner in the field, a no-nonsense man with a sharp mind and a knack for getting under her skin. The two had shared years of close calls and close quarters, building a bond forged in the heat of the investigation fires. Marcus had always been there, supporting her when the world seemed determined to tear her down. He was one of the few who didn't see her as a disabled woman first, but as a capable, fierce agent who could hold her own. "Marcus?" she asked, barely able to hide her shock. He was supposed to be in a different city, handling an unrelated case. The fact that he was here now felt like a cosmic twist of fate, or perhaps a sign that things were about to spiral out of control. The man who had introduced himself as an FBI agent turned toward Marcus with a look of recognition. "You weren't supposed to be here either," he muttered under his breath as though speaking to himself. Marcus didn't flinch. Instead, his eyes met Ayana's, and there was something in his gaze. A knowing. A warning. Ayana's stomach sank. If Marcus was here, if he was involved, then the situation was far more complicated than she had imagined. "What's going on?" Ayana asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but laced with urgency. She needed answers, and she needed them, fast. The weight of the unknown pressed down on her chest, making it harder to breathe, harder to think clearly. Marcus didn't answer immediately. Instead, he nodded toward the men, his eyes narrowed in concentration. The tension was palpable, but it was the look he gave Ayana next that unsettled her the most, something between concern and resignation. He was saying something without words. "This is bigger than you think." The silence that followed was suffocating. A taut string pulled so tight it could snap at any moment. Ayana's thoughts raced, but she couldn't make sense of the puzzle in front of her. Was she being pulled into something she wasn't ready for? Was she in danger, or was something else at play? All she knew was that whatever came next, it would change everything. And with that, the world around her seemed to freeze, the danger lingering in the air like an unsolved equation, its answer just out of reach. Ayana's grip tightened around the wheels of her chair, a subtle tremor in her hands betraying the calm she was trying to maintain. The tension around her had reached a boiling point, the men closing in on her like wolves surrounding a lone prey. The air was thick with hostility, and for the first time in a long while, Ayana could feel the weight of her vulnerability pressing down on her like never before. She was used to being underestimated, used to the way people treated her disability as a weakness, a reason to dismiss her ability, to overlook her worth. But this was different. This was more than just a passing glance or a misplaced comment. This felt like a deliberate attempt to break her, to push her to a point where she would either fall or rise. The man standing in front of her, the one who had called himself an FBI agent, was still watching her, his eyes unwavering, but there was something cold in his gaze. He wasn't just sizing her up, he was measuring her resolve, waiting to see if she would crumble under the pressure. Ayana felt the unease start to bubble inside her. She had been in tight situations before, but the sheer intensity of this moment was unlike anything she had faced. "Do you think you can walk away from this?" The tall man from earlier sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "You really don't know what you're messing with, do you?" Ayana met his gaze head-on, refusing to flinch. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with," she said, her voice steady but laced with an undercurrent of defiance. "And you're making a mistake if you think I'm afraid of you." The man's laugh was low and mocking. "You think you're some sort of hero? A broken woman in a chair trying to play with the big boys? You're out of your league, sweetheart." His words hit like a slap, but Ayana refused to let him see the sting. She had heard it all before, the dismissive comments, the snide remarks, the patronizing attitudes. What they didn't understand was that she had learned to thrive in the very spaces they tried to exclude her from. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen for who she truly was, not just the woman in a wheelchair, but the brilliant, relentless agent she had become. "I'm not afraid of you," she repeated, her voice colder now. "And I'm certainly not afraid of the men you're hiding behind." The man stepped closer, the air growing even more oppressive. "You think this is a game? You're in way over your head. You don't belong here. And the sooner you realize that, the better." His words were meant to provoke, to get under her skin. And for a brief moment, Ayana felt the familiar surge of doubt. It was a subtle feeling, like a whisper at the back of her mind telling her that maybe she wasn't enough, that maybe she had underestimated the danger. But she quickly squashed it. She wasn't going to let him win. Not now, not ever. As the man loomed over her, Ayana's thoughts briefly drifted to her childhood, to the lessons her mother had taught her, lessons that had kept her grounded during the darkest moments of her life. Her mother had been the one person who had never doubted her, who had always seen her potential, even when Ayana couldn't see it in herself. The memory of her mother's voice was a lifeline in this moment, a reminder that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. "You can't let anyone make you feel small, Ayana. Not because of your body, not because of your skin, and certainly not because of your gender. You have the power to take back what's yours. Never forget that." Ayana closed her eyes for a brief second, drawing in a shaky breath. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, louder than the sneers of the men around her. She wasn't going to let them diminish her. She wasn't going to let them rewrite the story of who she was. "I don't need your approval," Ayana said, her voice steady, now filled with a quiet power. "I've earned everything I have, and I'm not walking away." The tall man's expression faltered, his eyes narrowing as if he hadn't expected this reaction from her. For a split second, the power dynamic shifted, and Ayana saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes, but it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a smug smile. "Is that so?" he said, stepping back slightly. "We'll see how long that resolve lasts." The tension between them hung thick in the air, but just as Ayana thought she might be able to take control of the situation, she felt a sudden shift, a coldness that wasn't there before. The newcomer, the FBI agent who had approached her earlier, shifted his weight as though he were preparing to intervene. Ayana's heart raced, her senses on high alert. What was happening? Who was he really? And why had he come here to this street at this exact moment? Before she could react, Marcus stepped forward, his expression tense but determined. "Ayana, we need to move," he said, his voice urgent. "Now." Ayana's eyes flicked to him, her mind swirling. She had always trusted Marcus, but this moment felt different. There was something in his tone, something in the way he was standing that didn't sit right. He wasn't just trying to protect her. He was warning her. But from what? Was this really about her safety, or was there something deeper at play? The tall man, sensing the shift, looked at Marcus with narrowed eyes. "You're with her?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Another one who thinks they can save her from this?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Ayanna, his eyes filled with an intensity that she couldn't quite place. "It's not about saving her," he said, his voice hardening. "It's about making sure she doesn't make a mistake she can't undo." Ayanna's chest tightened, a sudden knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. What mistake was Marcus talking about? Was this about the case she had been investigating? Was there something she hadn't seen? The puzzle pieces were slowly starting to form, but there were still so many gaps. Why was she being targeted by these men? Why had they singled her out? The tall man scoffed, clearly growing impatient. "You think you can control her, just like you think you can control everything else, but you're wrong, you're all wrong." Ayanna's grip tightened around the chair again, the feeling of helplessness creeping back into her chest. She had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable. But she refused to let it consume her. She couldn't, not when so much was at stake. Marcus stepped closer to Ayanna, his hand hovering over her shoulder, as though he were about to guide her away. But just as he did, there was a sharp movement from one of the other men, the one who had been silent up until now. He made a quick motion, something swift and deliberate, and before Ayanna could react, Marcus stumbled backward, his face contorted in pain. The world around Ayanna seemed to slow. Her heart hammered in her chest as she watched Marcus fall, his hand clutching his side where the blow had landed. What had just happened? She was suddenly thrust into a new kind of panic. This wasn't just about threats anymore. It was real. The stakes were much higher than she had imagined. "Move," the tall man growled, his eyes locking onto Ayanna once more. "You don't get to walk away from this. Not now. Not ever." Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. Everything she had worked for, everything she had built, was hanging by a thread. And in this moment, with Marcus on the ground, she knew she had to make a choice: stand tall or let them win. As she reached for her phone, her hands shaking, the reality of what was happening began to sink in. There was no escaping this. Not now. Not ever. Ayanna's fingers trembled against the cool surface of her phone, the screen flickering as she hastily dialed the number she knew would lead to her only chance for help. Her mind was racing, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure the men around her could hear it. The reality of the situation had settled like a stone in her stomach. Marcus was down, bleeding, and Ayanna was no longer certain who the enemy was. The man standing before her, his smile more menacing now, wasn't just a street thug or a low-level criminal. He was something far more dangerous. He was calculated, strategic, and willing to escalate things to a level she wasn't prepared for. The phone call connected, but before Ayanna could speak, the tall man reached down, snatching it from her hands with a swift motion. "You really think help is coming?" he taunted, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think anyone is going to care about you? You're nothing but a distraction, a pawn." The words stung more than she wanted to admit, but Ayanna refused to let him see the effect they had. She fought to keep her emotions in check, her mind desperately searching for an escape, for something she could use to regain control. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind again, the words that had always kept her grounded. "You can't let anyone make you feel small." She wasn't going to let him take that from her. She wasn't going to break. Not now. "You're wasting your time," Ayanna said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "You'll regret this." The tall man's laugh was chilling, the sound of it vibrating through her bones. "Regret? I don't think so. You don't get to walk away from this, not after everything you've done." For a moment, Ayanna thought he was talking about the case, the investigation she had been working on for months, the one that had brought her here in the first place. But there was something in his eyes, something darker, that made her wonder, If this was about more than just a case. It felt personal, and Ayana had no idea why. She had never seen this man before, had never crossed paths with him in any of her operations. Her gaze flicked to Marcus, who was struggling to sit up, his face pale with pain. He had always been the strong one, the protector. Seeing him vulnerable, hurt, was a painful reminder of how quickly everything could unravel. Ayana had always been the one in control, the one who was relied upon. But now, as the situation spiraled further out of her control, she felt more helpless than she ever had before. "Get up, Marcus," she muttered under her breath, not even sure if he could hear her. "We need to move." But before he could answer, the tall man gave a signal, and one of his associates stepped forward, a gun gleaming in the low light. Ayana's stomach twisted as the barrel was pointed directly at Marcus. The sight was enough to send a wave of panic crashing over her. She had been trained to stay calm under pressure, to think and act in the heat of the moment, but nothing had prepared her for this. The weight of the gun in the air, the cold, empty stare of the man holding it, it was too much. "Please," Ayana said, her voice faltering for the first time, though she quickly regained her composure. "Don't do this. Let him go." The man with the gun didn't respond. Instead, he took a step closer to Marcus, the sound of his boots on the concrete echoing in the tense silence. The barrel of the gun hovered, and Ayana's heart seemed to stop. This was it. This was the moment she had feared would come, the moment where everything would break down. But just as the man raised the gun, another voice cut through the air, sharp, commanding. "Stop!" The words were enough to stop the man in his tracks, his hand hovering mid-air. Ayana's head whipped around, her breath catching as a new figure appeared, emerging from the shadows. This was no ordinary bystander. This was someone who moved with the same confidence, the same cold determination Ayana had seen in only the highest-ranking operatives. His face was partially obscured, but the silhouette of his frame, the look in his eyes, told Ayana everything she needed to know. This was no coincidence. This was someone who knew exactly what was going on. For a moment, Ayana thought she might be imagining it. Maybe this was just another twist in the tangled web she had found herself in. But the man's voice, commanding and resolute, held a truth she couldn't ignore. "Put the gun down," he ordered again, this time more forcefully. The man with the gun hesitated, glancing back at the leader, his brow furrowed in confusion. The leader narrowed his eyes, clearly thrown off by the interruption. "And who the hell are you?" he spat, his voice filled with venom. The newcomer didn't flinch. "Someone you don't want to mess with," he said calmly. "I suggest you listen to me before things get worse for all of us." Ayana's pulse raced as the tension in the air intensified. This was it. This was the moment where things could go one way or the other. The newcomer was either their savior or their undoing, and Ayana didn't know which. But what she did know was that she couldn't afford to wait around and find out. The clock was ticking, and Marcus was still vulnerable. She needed to act, and fast. She shifted slightly in her chair, using the moment of distraction to her advantage. "Get him out of here," she hissed under her breath, hoping the newcomer could hear her. "Now." The newcomer gave her a sharp, quick nod, signaling his understanding. But there was no time for more. The men around them were already starting to regroup, growing more agitated by the second. It was clear that whatever game they had been playing was about to turn deadly serious. And Ayana wasn't about to let them win. Before she could make her next move, one of the men stepped forward again, his demeanor darker than before. "You really think you can walk away from this?" He sneered at Ayana, his words filled with venom. "You're a fool." The leader, watching the standoff unfold, gestured sharply. "Enough of this," he barked. "We're done playing games." The tension in the air shifted again, this time like the gathering storm before a hurricane. Everything was about to break, but Ayana still didn't know who was going to come out on top. She could feel the weight of her decision pressing down on her. The next few seconds could determine everything. There was no room for mistakes, no second chances. One wrong move, and it could all come crashing down. With the leader's next command, the situation took a dramatic turn. The men surrounding Ayanna and Marcus moved with terrifying speed, and the room felt smaller, the walls closing in. Ayanna's heart thudded in her chest, but she refused to show fear. She wasn't about to let them see her weakness. Her mind raced, scanning the surroundings, searching for something, anything that could help her turn the tide. It was in moments like this, when everything seemed lost, that Ayanna knew she had to rely on her instincts. She could fight back. She had to. Just as she began to make her move, the lights flickered. A loud crash echoed through the street, and the air seemed to change. The newcomer, the mysterious figure, took advantage of the distraction. He lunged forward, a flash of movement that Ayanna couldn't quite track, but it was enough to send the chaos into overdrive. In that moment, the leader's face twisted with rage as everything started to unravel. But Ayanna wasn't ready to see where it would lead. The final piece of the puzzle was falling into place, and she knew that the truth was about to be revealed. But would she survive long enough to understand it? Or was this the moment she would lose everything? As the sounds of struggle and movement escalated around her, Ayanna's world seemed to shift. The battle wasn't over, but was this the beginning of her escape? Or was it the point of no return?